Hello, church family. Good to have you joining me digitally today. To those who attend our church in person, I have to begin with a short apology. I meant to tell you last week that I would be away this Sunday celebrating Noah's 11th birthday. So there's a distinct possibility that while you are watching this video, I will be screaming down a water slide at Great Wolf Lodge in the Poconos. Good chance of that happening. I'm looking forward to it. I am really. To those of you who typically join us on YouTube, welcome. Glad that you've been following us. For everyone, the QR code is going to come up on the screen, and you can scan that if you would like to have access to the PDF for today's notes. To those who do follow us on YouTube and you've been keeping up with the series that way, just so you know, we've gotten emails asking, where are the notes? Can I access them somehow? The video description, if you drop that down in YouTube, the link to the website is right there. And if you go to that website, every PDF for all weeks that we've covered so far will be available for download. You can keep them, you can share them. They're there to edify and bless the church. So I hope that this has been a blessing to you so far. We're going into week 6 today, the saved and the sealed, and we are looking at Revelation chapter 7. I'm very excited to look at this. Again, the book gets more and more exciting as we go on. So have your Bibles out and ready. We will be referencing the text as we go through it, not necessarily reading it except for key portions, just to keep concise and on task. Now, when we get to Revelation chapter 7, you want to remember we're still in the same vision. It's a different section for us, but John is still in the same place. He has just witnessed the first of 6 seals opening up, and with each one, there's been a greater and greater degree of chaos and judgment righteously unleashed on the earth from the heavenly throne room. And so we're going to break this chapter up into 2 sections. The first, talking, of course, about the 144,000, that great multitude that is numbered and coming from a certain location in verses 1 through 8. After that, we're going to be looking at verses 9 through 17 at the great multiethnic crowd that no one can number and is celebrating salvation before the throne of the Lamb. So without further ado, we're going to get into the notes. Section 7, and they will come up on your screen as I go through them, so be sure to follow along. So after seeing the destruction of the first, or rather the opening of the 6th seal, John beholds new angelic activity taking place in the heavens. He sees 4 angels that come down and hold back the 4 winds of the earth, and they're not allowing the wind to blow on any part of creation until a certain activity takes place, and that is the sealing of the servants of God. Now, going ahead in our notes here, 4 angels hold back the wind from blowing on any part of creation. What are the 4 winds? This is not a new idea. This is something that's very common throughout the Old Testament, especially in prophetic literature. The 4 winds often refer figuratively to the known world. Okay, so in some way, shape, or form, when you're reading about the 4 winds, it's talking about the known world. For example, in Jeremiah 49:36, God says that he is going to scatter an enemy nation to the 4 winds, meaning he is going to scatter them in every direction across the known world. They will be so dispersed as a people, they'll never be able to unite again. It's a severe judgment that he's bringing upon the people of Elam. And then in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel sees the 4 winds stirring up the sea, and that's when the 4 beasts, the 4 beastly kingdoms, the demonic kingdoms rise up out of the ocean and begin to unleash havoc on the earth. So in that case, you have the nations of the known world being stirred in rebellion against God's kingdom. So whenever you're reading about the 4 winds in the Old Testament, it's usually pointing to the known world, and God is about to direct some activity in it, whether it's an act of judgment or if it's actually an act of rebellion against him. Now, in Revelation 7, the 4 winds may be a recapitulation. There's that $5 word that we've been using week after week. They might be a recapturing of the 4 horsemen and their judgments. Now, there's a few really good reasons for us to take this position. First of all, in Zechariah chapter 6 and in Zechariah chapter 1, we found that there are 4 horsemen there in the prophet's vision, and they are the prototype for what John sees in Revelation chapter 6. So the 4 horsemen are sent out in Zechariah to the nations. They patrol the earth, and they report back to God that all of the nations that are hostile toward him are at rest, but his people are still in affliction. And that leads to intercession being made for the nation of Israel before the throne of God. But now in Revelation 6, those horsemen get repurposed. They're not sent out to patrol the earth and to report back on the peace of the nations. They are sent out to take peace from the nations. And in Zechariah chapter 6, those four horsemen are connected to the four winds of heaven. And so a lot of scholars have said, there's a good chance that that connection with Zechariah is still being maintained here in chapter 7. And so the four winds being held back, they might be an embodiment of the chaos of the four horsemen actually hitting the earth. And so if that's the case, we have the judgment of the six seals. We're getting a flashback. Revelation 7 is actually taking us back a few steps in time to before the vision even happens. So that's a good way to see what's going on here. So it will be revealed that the winds are harmful and therefore connected to the judgment of God. So again, good reasons to see the four winds in chapter 7 as a recapitulation of the four horsemen from chapter 6. Now, letter C in your notes, there are three significant theological implications of seeing the four winds as a recapitulation of the four horsemen. First of all, as I said, it means the dramatic judgments of chapter 6 are to be seen as preceded by the sealing of God's people. So it's almost as if John just watched all these events unfold in Revelation 6, events pertaining to God's justice on the earth against hostile nations, but then he's shown a flashback, something that actually took place in heaven prior to the unleashing of those judgments, meaning these judgments were not just indiscriminately released on the earth. God took time to protect his people before he allowed the chaos to go forth. So that makes it a very compelling picture. John sees all of the destruction from the four horsemen and the judgments thereafter, but then he is shown after the fact the people of God were preserved the entire time. So again, that's the first implication. The judgments are preceded by the sealing of God's people. Secondly, it means that the martyrs that we saw in chapter 6, verse 9, the souls under the altar at the opening of seal number 5, they didn't die unprotected. They didn't die or get martyred for their faith because God failed to come through for them. No, their faith was protected. So this sealing of the servants of God that John is about to see in Revelation chapter 7, it's not a guarantee of physical protection. It's a guarantee to have supernaturally sustained faith. That no matter what rage comes from hostile forces or demonic forces against the people of God, they are going to be enabled to stand through all of it. So the sealing that John is seeing in chapter 7, if people die during the impending judgments, it does not mean God failed to protect them. The fact that they died as faithful martyrs shows he did protect them. Their faith, like it says in 1 Peter, was being kept by the power of God. And the third implication is that the two companies that we're going to meet in Revelation 7, the 144,000 and the multi-ethnic crowd, are the answer to the question of chapter 6, verse 17. If you read that verse, you find that all the kings of the earth, all of the noble, right down to the poorest of the poor, are hiding from the wrath of the Lamb, and they say, the day of God's anger has come, and who can stand? Who can stand? And then chapter 7 begins, and it's almost as if John is being shown by the angel, I'll show you who can stand. Who can stand before the wrath of the Lamb? It's those who are allegiant to him. The loyal have nothing to fear, even when God is bringing in a season of judgment on the unrighteous and on the wicked of the nations. So the two companies, the 144,000, the multi-ethnic crowd, they are the divinely given answer to that burning question of the heathen in chapter 6, verse 17. Who can stand before this God? His chosen people can. His covenant people are able to stand before him without any fear. In verses 2 and 3, another angel rises from the east, carrying a seal and giving command to the angels of the four winds. And the purpose of the seal is to mark the faithful to protect them from God's judgment. Now, we're not given detail on what the seal is. What is it that the angel's carrying? Is it an inkhorn of some kind? Is it a brand? We don't know. All we know is that a mark is going to be placed on the foreheads of the people of God, and they are to be protected from all of the judgments. In the midst of the chaos that will come, they are to be enabled and empowered to stand. And this is an echo of Ezekiel chapter 9, where the righteous are marked for protection just before the wicked are slain. It's a very brutal section of prophecies in the book of Ezekiel. Chapter 9 tells us that God is moved to judgment, beginning at his house in Jerusalem, beginning at the temple precinct. He is going to purge the city of all of the wickedness. But before the judgment falls, he sends out an angel with an inkhorn to mark every person who weeps and groans over the iniquity that's committed in the city. And then the destroying angels are sent through to do their work. Now, the Passover is also at play here. The Passover is the basis for Revelation 7 and for Ezekiel chapter 9, because that is the first time that a sign was given to God's people to protect them from God's wrath. At the Passover in Exodus 12, God said, this judgment that I'm sending, this 10th plague, is going to fall on all the land. Up until that point, there was a distinction between the land of the Egyptians and Goshen, where the Israelites dwelt. Plagues fell on Egypt and nothing touched the land of Goshen. God made a distinction between the two peoples to show who belonged to him and who was hostile toward him. But the 10th plague would fall across both provinces, the mainland of Egypt and the province of Goshen. And the only thing that would guarantee protection from the wrath of God was the blood of the Lamb painted over their doorways. Similarly, in Ezekiel chapter 9, judgment is going to fall on all the land of Israel, and only those marked by God will stand. Revelation chapter 7, God's judgment is falling on all the nations, and only those marked as allegiant to him will have the power to stand. So no harm is to come from the judgments until the saints have been sealed. Like Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4, the mark is placed on the foreheads of the faithful in Revelation 7. And this is important because this is going to be what the dragon, the red dragon symbolizing Satan, he's going to parody this with the mark of the beast in Revelation chapter 13. Remember, the mark of the beast goes on the forehead. And this is obviously a mockery of the mark of God put on the foreheads of the faithful in Revelation 7, Ezekiel 9, and elsewhere. Now, the role of the right hand, we're going to find this when we get to chapter 13. The mark of the beast is also a false Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your might. That law of loving God with everything was meant to be written on the forehead and on the right hand. And so the fact that that's where the mark of the beast goes, there's a lot in God's economy that Satan wants to make a mockery of with the kingdom he's building through the Antichrist in Revelation chapter 13. So again, the mark that we're seeing in Revelation 7, that's not the only place that appears. This is a very significant image. When you and I choose to live faithfully for God, no matter what spirit of Antichrist might be opposing us in our generation, if we live to see the ultimate Antichrist come, and we have to face any portion of that trial, when we choose to live faithfully, the mark of God is set upon us, and he will preserve us. He'll make a distinction between us and the nations, between the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, in letter B in your notes, John hears 144,000 saints sealed for protection from a modified list of Israel's tribes. Now, we're going to get a little technical here, and it's because we need to. Again, this is one of those areas where I want to steer us away from a hyper-literalistic interpretation because it creates a lot of problems that we can't really answer. This is not a common list or even clear list of Israel's tribes. It's very uncommon. It's modified in a few key ways, and I'm going to show you what they are. But I can only give you theories in terms of explaining why has John modified this list. First of all, Joseph is listed with his son Manasseh, but it should have been Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh were considered half-tribes, together comprising a whole tribe. And the reason why this happened was because Joseph was given the birthright instead of Reuben, who was the true firstborn. Reuben defiled his father's couch with one of his concubines, and so the birthright passed from Reuben and went to Joseph, even though he was the second to youngest. Only Benjamin came after him. And so his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were counted as patriarchs rather than their father. It was an incredible honor on Joseph and on his lineage. But instead of Ephraim being listed, Joseph is listed. And there's no real clear explanation for why that happens. The thing that I will explore a little bit, though, is the fact that the tribe of Dan is missing from the list entirely, which may reflect the belief that the Antichrist would come from the tribe of Dan. Now, if you've not come across that before, follow me close. If you have heard of that idea before, maybe this will give you more clarity. Again, it's a theory, but it's an interesting and compelling one, and I think it's worth us giving some attention to. So again, Dan is completely missing from the list of Israelite tribes. His name is omitted, and it may reflect the belief that the Antichrist would come from that tribe. Irenaeus and Hippolytus were two very prominent church fathers, and they are the earliest writers to defend this idea. Even Jewish rabbis have, in some ways, indirectly backed it up, but nothing prior to the medieval period. But Irenaeus and Hippolytus lived right after the apostolic era closed, when all the apostles died, and they begin to defend this. Jacob, they point out, prophetically spoke of Dan as a serpent and then prayed for salvation. When you read Genesis 49, Jacob is blessing his sons and prophesying over them just before his death. And when he gets to Dan, he says, Dan shall be a serpent or a viper along the roadside, snapping at the heels of horses, making the riders fall off. And then he says, I have waited, O Lord, for your salvation. And there's very little to tell us. Is this a positive prophecy or is it a negative prophecy? Is Jacob seeing Dan as the source of God's salvation? Or is he the thing that Jacob wants to be saved from? It's a little ambiguous. In Deuteronomy 33, Moses prophesies over each of the tribes of Israel, and he calls Dan a lion cub leaping from Bashan. Now, Bashan was the abode of Baal, the fertility god that Israel constantly got pulled in to worshiping. Now, those are the arguments that Irenaeus and Hippolytus would raise in contending that the Antichrist would come from the tribe of Dan. But it gets even more interesting because Jewish literature from the medieval period depicts Dan as a portrait of evil doing. Dan welcomed Jeroboam's idol. Now, there's a lot of biblical history in here. When Solomon was reaching the point of his death, the kingdom of Israel was split into two: Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And northern Israel followed after a man named Jeroboam. And Jeroboam was afraid that if the people kept traveling south into Judah to worship at Jerusalem, he would lose their loyalty. Their hearts would go back to David. They would want to reunite the kingdoms, and he would lose power. So what did he do? He crafted two golden calves. He put one in Bethel, the south border of Israel between Israel and Judah, and he put another one in Dan, the northernmost border of Israel. And he said, these are your gods that brought you up from the land of Egypt. Worship here. And this became a grievous, grievous sin. And it's actually said by the rabbis of the medieval period and onward that Dan was the tribe that welcomed him. They didn't resist. They didn't object. They said, absolutely, set up your golden calf here, Jeroboam. We'll gladly worship at that altar. And in a commentary, a rabbinic commentary on the book of Numbers called Bamidbar Rabbah, it says that that act brought darkness upon all the land. So in a way, they see it as prophetic. Dan was the northernmost tribe in Israel's territory, and north was often associated with evil. There are many places in the prophetic books of the Old Testament where danger or disaster are coming out of the north. And sometimes it's simply nations that live north of Israel. Sometimes it's a bit murky. Could it be referring to the northernmost border of Israel being the source of the evil? And when you read these rabbinic writings, it's almost as if Dan's placement north of the tabernacle in Numbers chapter 2 is taken prophetically. Because when you read the rabbinic writings, these commentaries on the books of Numbers and otherwise, they will list Dan's placement north of the tabernacle last. It's almost as if they're saying Dan welcomed Jeroboam's idol, they invited darkness to come over the land, and that is why they were placed north of the tabernacle. But that happened hundreds of years before. It seems that the rabbis see this as a prophetic act of God, that God placed Dan north of the tabernacle because he knew that Dan would eventually cave and welcome idolatry and welcome that kind of sin into their midst. Now, again, we can't be 100% certain about this, but it certainly is a compelling thought to pursue nonetheless. Now, with that being established about the identities of the tribes, the editing of the tribal list, as we just saw, letter C in your notes, it's highly unlikely that these numbers and tribes are meant to be taken in a strictly literal sense. Again, we don't want to be strictly literal or strictly symbolic. We want to allow for some nuance in the way that we approach this because we want to see what John saw, How is the original writer most likely to have understood that? And then we can go from there and trying to apply it to our own life and time. Now, speaking of John's day, nearly all distinction between the 12 tribes was lost when he was alive due to multiple dispersions. Intermarriage between tribes and other nations had eroded genealogical clarity. So, again, even when John was alive, it's the end of the first century, and even then, it was very tenuous about who belonged to what tribe or what lineage. Only Judah, Benjamin, and Levi were recognized as clear ancestors, which is an interesting thing to note because the genealogies of Jesus are very, very clear for us. And Judah was a tribe that had maintained genealogical clarity. But the 10 tribes of northern Israel, as well as some of the Levites, were largely considered lost at this time because Israel, the northern kingdom where the 10 tribes lived, they were dispersed to Assyria before the southern kingdom of Judah was. And they had intermarried with Syrian peoples, and that's where the Samaritans came from. Their genealogical clarity had eroded a long time ago. And so, even in John's day, it's uncertain if he would have seen this as a literal 12,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel. Modern Jews, that's another layer of the problem because if we look to this in the future sense, what about modern Jews today? Modern Jews cannot trace their lineages back to the patriarchs. Now, the information I'm giving you here, I gave you a footnote in the handout that you can look at. This is coming straight out of a resource called the Jewish Encyclopedia. The furthest back a single Jewish lineage reaches is AD 1375. And that's based on tombstone inscriptions, not necessarily on a recorded family tree. There are some extremely rare cases that date back to the 16th century. But most lineages only go back a few hundred years. So again, while God is not limited, that's not the issue here. It's not a question of what God is capable of. A literal ceiling of 144,000 ethnic Jews is fraught with difficulty. Now, this does not speak to whether God is done with Israel. It doesn't say a word about that. We'll get to that in a few moments. It's just a question of how are we to understand these tribal names as well as the numbers assigned to them. John himself is probably seeing something more wonderful than only an ethnic ingathering. So again, there is going to be a kind of literal sense to this, but there's a much more significant theological layer that John is going to pile on top. What I want to suggest is at letter D in your notes, the numbers are symbolic for the preservation of God's end time army, which will oppose the Antichrist. Let me read that one more time. The numbers are symbolic for the preservation of God's end time army, which will oppose the Antichrist. So this would be right in line with what Daniel says in chapter 11, that those who know their God will be strong and take action. Now, the reason why we come to this conclusion is because the numbering of the tribes that John hears in Revelation 7 is reminiscent of an Old Testament military census. This is exactly what you see taking place in the book of Numbers, right in chapter 1. The people are numbered who are old enough to go out to war. So this is a military census that's happening in Revelation chapter 7. So is it about the ethnicity of the warriors, or is it which kingdom they serve? That's in question. I want to insist that's the more fundamental issue at stake. Not only that, but the number 12 became a common symbolic number in Jewish literature for the people of God. The New Testament authors seem to make use of this symbolism. For example, in James chapter 1, when he opens his letter, he says, to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. Now, it is very possible he is merely greeting Christian Jews that are scattered throughout the Roman Empire. His audience is exclusively Jewish, but Jews who have converted to Christ as Messiah. But it's also possible that he's giving this as a general address to the Christians, Jew and Gentile alike, who are truly in exile, the real pilgrims that are wandering this earth and looking for a home. So what I want to suggest is that John sees God's army as a force of 12 12s multiplied 1,000-fold. Okay, so this is not about ethnicity or background or even a literal number. It's not about the exact count. It's what this image of 144,000 soldiers is embodying. A force of 12 12s multiplied 1,000-fold. Why? Because the use of 12 probably communicates covenant relationship. Again, the number 12, because of the 12 patriarchs, took on symbolism who belongs to the covenant community, who belongs to the kingdom of God, who is part of God's covenant people. And so the fact that you have 12,000, 12,000, 12,000, 12,000, 12 times, well, it must communicate the covenant people of God, whoever they are, wherever they're from. Those who choose to live with allegiance, yielded to the Lamb as opposed to the dragon, they are part of God's end time army. They will be given the power to stand and resist the spirit of Antichrist. Now, the use of 1,000, which is 10 times 10 times 10, probably communicates something like judgment or even power. A lot of judgment imagery, but again, it's against the enemies of God, not against those faithful to him. 10 is very often a number signifying judgment or justice in the Old Testament. God said he would spare Sodom if he found 10 righteous men there. God gave Moses 10 commandments. God struck Egypt with 10 plagues. God barred Israel from entering Canaan after 10 acts of defiance. In Numbers 16, he says, these 10 times now they have refused to believe me. So the number 10 became a kind of symbol for moments of justice on God's part against wicked acts of humanity. So again, you have the number 12, communicating covenant relationship, the number 10, communicating judgment or power, all of that multiplied 1,000-fold. 12 12s, 1,000 times. So again, who is the 144,000? It's God's end time army that will be empowered to oppose the Antichrist. Now that brings us to the great multitude that we meet in verses 9 through 17. And the first thing we need to look at is the way John introduces them, because we're going to find that he is repeating a pattern. Letter A, under section 2, the way John introduces this innumerable multitude signals to us that he is seeing the same group, but from a different angle. So yes, I do want to suggest that there is really little distinction between the 144,000, the end-time army, and the multitude worshiping in heaven. We're going to take the position that it is the same group of people, and there's nuance to this, but they are being viewed from two different theological angles, giving us a fuller picture of what it means to be a part of God's end-time army. And the reason why we're driving at this is because, first of all, John repeats a pattern from Revelation chapter 5. In verses 5 to 6, he is being introduced to the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And what happens is he receives information from an angel, and then he looks to see what the angel is talking about, and he sees something very unexpected. In Revelation 5, verses 5 to 6, he is told about a lion, but he sees a lamb instead. What he hears and what he sees are not the same thing in terms of description, but in terms of essence, they are the same. John wasn't misinformed. Jesus really is the lion lamb. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he is the Lamb of God. And in chapter 7, we have the same pattern being repeated again. In chapter 7, verses 4 and 9, he is told about a Jewish army of 144,000, but then he sees a worshiping multi-ethnic throng. So again, this is very similar. It's exactly parallel to the pattern of Revelation 5. He hears information, looks to see what's being described, but what he sees is very different from what he heard. And it's not because he was misinformed. It's not because he's misunderstanding the message. The Spirit is illuminating heavenly realities from multiple angles to ensure maximum understanding. That's exactly what's going on here. The 144,000 is one way to look at the people of God. They are the covenant, empowered, end-time army that will not bend the knee to the spirit of Antichrist. And they are also the worship leaders of heaven gathered around the throne in triumph. Two angles on the same group of people. Now, number 2, in this same section, repeating the pattern from Revelation 5, verses 5 to 6, centers the shared identity of the two groups on the Lamb. So that's even why that pattern. Why does he repeat that here? Because he wants to bring the Lamb of God back to the center. We are not meant to focus on the two communities. That's not the focus. The focus is, who are they to the Lamb? He is the one that put them in this position to begin with. And so the fact that John repeats that pattern, his introduction to the Lamb of God, he repeats that here in seeing the Lamb's people. I think that's a deliberate connection that he is establishing. So, repeating the pattern from Revelation 5 centers the shared identity of the two groups on the Lamb. Letter A under that, Jesus is the fulfillment of the hopes for the Jew first and the Gentile also. So, again, the 144,000 are described as soldiers sealed from the tribes of Israel. But then the throng in heaven is from every nation and tongue under heaven. But that's the beauty of the people of God. Romans 1:16 is where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. And so you have that here. John sees the Jew first and also the Gentile. Two groups that actually have a shared identity being viewed and explored from two different angles. Jesus unites Jew and Gentile as one people under God. Ephesians chapter 2, Paul says, for he himself, speaking of Jesus, is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace. He's not talking about establishing peace between God and humanity. He's talking about the union of Jew and Gentile as one new people of God in Jesus Christ. Number three, the united groups point to two theological realities that are both distinguishable from each other and indivisible. Let me say that again. The united groups point to two theological realities that are both distinguishable and indivisible. And here's what they are. First of all, letter A, they point to the preservation of ingathered Jews as God's chosen people. He is not done with Israel. He still has a plan for his people. In Romans chapter 11, Paul says in verse 15, if Israel's rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So all Israel is going to be saved, and Paul associates that with the resurrection. He goes on in verse 25 to say, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. God still loves Israel, and they are still his chosen people. They're not saved apart from Jesus, but he does say he's going to bring them to Jesus before the end comes. And so John sees a promise of that God will seal a remnant of Israel and preserve them, but that doesn't exclude the Gentile faithful. And that's letter B. The second theological reality is the preservation of ingathered Gentiles as God's chosen people. Whoever is allegiant to the Lamb and chooses to resist the beast, they will be empowered by God to stand their ground. They will be sealed for protection no matter how much of the chaos, no matter how much of tribulation we are called to endure, we will be empowered to stand through whatever portion of it we have to see. Now, this is where things get very edifying and very, very exciting. Letter B, the worship of heaven shifts in leadership as the angels, elders, and living creatures now respond to the saints. That's in verses 9 through 12. And I love this. The saints, the multitude, they now stand closer to the throne than any other being in heaven. The elders, the living creatures, and all the angels are gathered around them, and they sing a song that cannot be echoed. The saints are closer to the throne than any other being in heaven, their white robes showcasing their holiness. They have been made white in the blood of the Lamb. They have a righteousness that's not their own, but a righteousness that comes from God. Their palm branches are a celebration of the Lamb's victory and of their participation in it. Palm branches were used to celebrate the Exodus as well as the Feast of Tabernacles when God kept Israel in the desert. So now these saints are celebrating the Lamb, delivering them from and preserving them through an Antichrist world. All of that imagery is being recaptured and repurposed here in the heavenly throne room to show this is the reward of not giving allegiance to the dragon. This is the reward of yielding all of your loyalty to Jesus. You're made white. You have a rank and a status higher than any angelic being could hope to imagine, and you sing a song that they cannot echo. Number three, the song of the saints is unique and cannot be echoed by any angel because it celebrates God's salvation in Christ. The Song of the Saints is a single word that captures God's holy love and their experience of it. They simply say, salvation to our God and to the Lamb. That's all that they sing. One attribute, one quality, one divine act, because it celebrates the sum of God's beauty, that an incredible, holy God would stoop low to save wretched sinners like us. He is worthy. And the angels, who have no participation in that act of salvation, who do not know that kind of covenant love, all they can do is fall down and worship and say, yes, blessing and glory, dominion and honor. They can sing of all of God's attributes, but they can't sing the song of salvation. That is a privilege that has been given exclusively to you and to me, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, to anyone who chooses to stand in that end-time army in any generation and says, I refuse to bend my knee to the spirit of Antichrist. I refuse to give my allegiance to the dragon. Their response, or pardon me, letter B in your notes, the love of God for humanity is a mystery to the angels, and they're mesmerized by it. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12 tells us that angels long to look into the promises of God made to us in Christ. And so their response, the response of the angels, requires 7 ascriptions of praise to match the beauty of the saints' one-line song. All the saints sing is salvation, and the angels have to put 7 attributes in there just to match it, to give an appropriate echo to the worship that we will lead someday. The fact that they fall while the saints remain standing, and that's an important thing to bring out. The saints are standing around the throne, and it never says that they fall down. It doesn't mean that we're not going to bow in heaven. I think what John is seeing is the incredible dignity that God has awaiting his sons and his daughters for their faithfulness to him. Every other being in heaven falls on its face. And what this does is it accents the dignity that God shows his sons and his daughters. When you and I remain faithful and we cross the finish line with all of our loyalty yielded to Jesus, you have a rank higher than the angels awaiting you. There's a status that you're going to inherit that comes with being a child of the King. The angels are all servants of God. He doesn't call any of them son. That's what the book of Hebrews says. But you are a son, you are a daughter, and you have a higher rank or status than they do. Letter C, an elder then reveals the identity of the great multitude to an uncertain John. He comes and asks him, who are these people? Where do they come from? And John gives an answer like Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 37, he's asked, can these dry bones live? And he says, well, Lord, you know. And John says a similar answer to the angel. I don't know who they are. You know who they are. You know where they've come from. And the elder identifies the multitude as the redeemed who are coming out of great tribulation. Now, I do need to be technical here in terms of language. Not every English version captures this, but at letter A in your notes, the elder's grammar indicates an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process. The ESV and the CSB capture this well, where it says, these are the ones coming out of great tribulation. They are coming out of the great tribulation. So the multitude may be another angle on the martyrs of chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. So it shows that there's a progression as saints in the end-time army are dying in their faithfulness to their God. They are brought to heaven, and they're part of that multi-ethnic throng now worshiping around the throne. So the martyrs who were crying out for justice in chapter 6, they have now had those pleas for justice replaced with praise. Instead of weeping in tears, there's now a song and worship in its stead. Like many elements of Revelation, the Great Tribulation, that phrase, requires a layered understanding. It definitely has a future function. We find that in Matthew chapter 24, verse 21, which is distinctly eschatological. It points to the future, it points to the end, but it also has a present function. In Revelation chapter 2, when Jesus is speaking to the church at Thyatira, he uses great tribulation not to speak of the future, but to speak of the present. He says, I'm going to take Jezebel and all of her lovers, and I'm going to throw them into great tribulation because of their refusal to repent. And so that phrase, great tribulation, it can embody God's future intentions for how he is going to judge the nations at the end, but it also speaks to what he allows to come upon this world at times and seasons that he deems appropriate before the end comes. And so, again, you have a future element as well as a present element at play in Revelation chapter 7. So, the elder's answer here suggests that Revelation 7 is concerned with the present suffering of faithful Christians. So, the multitude then embodies the destiny of Christians who faithfully suffer now as well as at the end of the age. So this is not something that is going to come later. It's something that you can inherit in this moment. If you and I die and we leave this life before Christ returns to rapture us home, we're going to inherit that vision of Revelation 7 now, but it's also the reward that will be given to those who suffer at the end. Letter C under that, the most important point about the multitude's identity is their relationship to the Lamb. Again, Jesus is King, and he is front and center every page of this book. Their victory, the multitude's victory, the 144,000's victory in Great Tribulation, is only because of the blood of the Lamb. It was the Lamb's sacrifice that kept them unstained by the corruption of the tribulation. It was his power that kept them standing and kept them enduring. And that's the testimony that you and I are going to have as well. Now, in letter D, as we begin to bring things to a close here, the elder then outlines the blessed reward of the faithful with a litany of Old Testament promises. When you read verses 15 through 17, and the elder is telling John all of the wonderful things that are going to happen, they're before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night. He will shelter them with his presence. They shall hunger no more, thirst no more. The sun shall not strike them. These are all Old Testament prophecies that he is now bringing to bear on God's covenant people in Revelation 7. And so I've made a chart for you in the handout that you can look at, and it'll also be on the screen to you, for you rather. So I'm going to read through this quickly. In verse 17, you have a citation of a reference to Isaiah chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. It says, "Then Yahweh will create over all the site of Mount Zion and over her assembly a cloud by day and smoke and the brightness of flaming fire by night. Indeed, over all the glory there will be a canopy, and it will be a shelter for shade from the heat by day and a refuge and a hiding place from rainstorm and from rain." So again, that promise of being sheltered by the very presence of God applied in Revelation 7 is drawn from Isaiah chapter 4. In Revelation 7, verse 16, he says, "They shall hunger no more, they shall not thirst any more, the sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat." That's from Isaiah 49, verse 10, and from Psalm 121, verses 5 and 6. And then in Revelation 7, verse 17, the last verse, where the angel describes the reward, he says, "For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Thanks be to God. That's three different passages that are being summarized there. Lines are being taken and reconstructed into a renewed promise of renewed hope. In Ezekiel 34, verse 23, Psalm 23, verses 1 and 2, and Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8. I encourage you to read through those on your own, and I'm sure they'll encourage and bless you. Our final section, under letter E, what John is ultimately seeing is both the present suffering and the future glory of God's covenant people. Again, you have one community that's comprised of two groups, and they're being viewed from two separate angles to give us a full portrait of who and what they are. On earth, we are God's army, commissioned and empowered to resist Antichrist in every age, from now till the end of time. While we get these little foreshadows of Antichrist that 1 John 3 warns us about, or if we live to see the ultimate Antichrist coming at the end, we will face suffering and persecution. We will be called to stand firm in a world that's falling apart. But in heaven, the heavenly reality is that we are God's renewed priesthood, commissioned to lead the worship of heaven for eternity. I'm very excited about that. And when I read passages like these, I don't want to get transfixed on, again, the chronological order of events. How is this going to get down? I just want to see what's across the finish line. Because whether we're going to get raptured out before, during, or after some of this stuff takes place, I just want to make it to the end. I am so convinced of the beauty of what's coming. I don't care what it costs me to get there. I don't care what it costs me to cross the finish line and lay my eyes on Jesus unashamed, knowing that despite all of my failures, I did give him my heart. I did give him my allegiance and my loyalty. The season that we're in right now, we are God's end time army. We are called to actively resist evil, and evil is likely only going to intensify as the day draws near for Christ to return. Let's make sure we live out both of these realities. I want to live out being the 144,000 right now so that I can be a part of that multi-ethnic throng when the end comes. Thank you again so much for your time. I love you very much. God bless you. I'll see you next week.